Welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. We are kicking off a new cycle season theme. We haven't really decided on that part of it yet.
You've used the word cycle a number of times
I
now.
like cycle. I
So
do.
let's stick with that. Let's stop being wishy-washy.
Let's be decisive here.
Yeah, like the movies we're going to watch. Very decisive.
Exactly. So the new cycle that we're kicking off with our first episode here is Existential Thrillers.
Woo!
I think you kind of were looking in the direction of thrillers. I was like, okay, but I want to be something more specific and weird and more kind of like add a layer to it. So I was, let's do existential thrillers. I guess we should try and define that.
Sure.
The Socratic method to define our terms. So, I mean, thriller, I think everybody knows, right? What's a thriller? What would you say a thriller is to you, Chris?
Yeah, and I actually just got done talking about this with my students because that's a common, I think, gray area in like film genres is like thriller kind of fits this weird space between drama and horror. I'd like to think that anyways. There's suspense and tension, but it doesn't necessarily focus too much on gore or monsters, though it could. It's more set in a real world with maybe some elements that are foreboding and inexplicable. But I mean, in a literary sense, since I know that's what you got your master's in, what is a thriller?
Essentially it's something that's suspenseful with some sense of danger, and oftentimes there's a mystery element involved.
Sure.
I think to me a thriller has to have building tension and suspense, and usually there's a release by the end. It's pretty much that simple. There's like crossover between, and we're going to talk about The Killing of a Sacred Deer, which could be like kind of a thriller and a horror, kind of mishmashed together a little bit. But I think it's almost like, I would say in my mind, thriller might be more generalized, and like horror technically might live underneath it in some way. It's like a more umbrella term.
Sure.
But I think everybody kind of has an idea of what a thriller is. The tougher part of this is existential.
Yes. And
where do you want to bite into the apple of that? Huh?
we're kind of, good job setting up the metaphor for men. We're kind of cementing ourselves with these genre tags as being the theme of a given cycle of films, looking through the history and evolution and current status of the world of movies through philosophy, because we basically talked about a very simple version of postmodernism with self-aware horror, from Scream 2022 all the way to Last House on the Left 1972, and here we are doing something a little similar, I feel, in which you've got essentially a philosophy that's being the center of a mystery movie. So I think there is that mysterious element to it. It's just more found in like the cerebral kind of thrillers. I think that's the Netflix tag version of what we're doing. Right. But I mean, I used to teach existentialism when reading The Stranger with 12th graders, but I haven't really thought about the term in a while. So what do you think of? What kind of characters are we dealing with? What kind of protagonists are at the center of existential thrillers?
Well, I think it's like, the term's tough for two reasons. One, because there is a philosophical movement that happened in the middle of the 20th century that is existentialism. And like, people might have a vague with Camus and Sartre and those types of people. They might have an understanding of that. I almost think that that's kind of its own thing, whereas the term existential has sort of taken on a life of its own, like language tends to do. Where, generally speaking, the most common phrase that people would say is, I'm having an existential crisis.
Sure, yeah.
And so that's kind of the starting point for a lot of people in this term. I mean, but the type of protagonists that we're looking at are people who tend to be alienated, people who tend to be confused about themselves, confused about the world, and not in a trivial way, in a very deep
life or death manner.
Yeah, almost metaphysical sense. They don't really know who they are. They don't really know what's going on. And there's a sense of, one of the key terms in existential philosophy is anxiety.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it's an alienation, it's a confusion that creates a lot of stress and anxiety, which I think everybody in modern day life can have a full understanding of this on a daily basis. And so I think when we're talking about existential thrillers, it's just adding those elements together. It's a thriller movie in a very traditional sense, with those key genre conventions, the suspense, the mystery element to it, but adding on that layer of confusion about who you are, confusion about where you are in the world, what other people are up to you, and where you fit into the world, that creates a sense of anxiety and unease.
Right. How you
And I think
identify yourself in relation to the world. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. There's a key element of sort of self-identity involved and a confusion with that. So I think that it's a pretty, like, I think it's a good bullseye. And what blows my mind is that we chose men to do this, not knowing what the film was really about,
Right.
because we chose this theme and cycle before we saw the film. I think we both saw it yesterday, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am blown away by how much of a home run that Men fits into the existential thriller category. It's almost like a textbook example of it.
And I was actually kind of worried because yes, we picked this tag when we were kind of titillated by the teaser trailer a few months ago, but there was very little information about what the actual plot of the film was, right? And then we get closer to release date, and there's a fuller trailer that's released, and it essentially ends up getting marketed. And I don't know if this A24 is doing, or the general critics' consensus and coverage of the film and interviews with Garland in the press circuit and what have you. But I feel like it's now being touted more as a horror film than as a thriller, which is kind of interesting because, and I was kind of worried going into that essentially we'd accidentally chosen another like slasher movie, but it actually, I find very little to do with the horror genre in this movie. And I think a large part of that has to do with the guy at the center of this all, which is writer-director Alex Garland. Yeah, of course, he actually was somebody that we discussed for the previous cycle when we had our episode on 28 Days Later. It's the 20th anniversary of that film, and so we went back and revisited it, and it was one of his earlier scripts, and way before he got into the directing game. But essentially, like we had talked about on that episode, there's so much that movie's trying to do that, yes, has like this skeleton of being like built on the bones of Romero's films, but essentially is doing all these other things with drama and thriller and suspense. And Alex Garland then, dove into sci-fi after that. So I was also a little bit concerned, like, wait, are we going to get some kind of like sci-fi explanation? We should probably set up what the heck is the log line of Men before we get too far, right?
Go for it. What is the log line?
Well, we're going to IMDb to make it as simple and incorrect as possible. They have for their synopsis: a young woman goes on a solo vacation to the English countryside following the death of her ex-husband. Period. No mention of what she finds there.
It doesn't feel like a vacation, though.
Yeah, it's like
it's more like a getaway. She's still like working, isn't it? Like she's like working on something.
Yeah,
so it's like it's the whole like remote work pandemic thing. A little bit. She's getting out to the countryside to sort of decompress after her husband's untimely. I guess it's spoiler alert. It's not really a spoiler. Suicide.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of see it in the opening shots, right? Yeah. But it's kind of left open as to whether or not it is definitively a suicide, and it's also not definitively her ex-husband. It's like they're in the midst of separating.
Correct. They have not gotten a divorce yet.
Right.
I think that's stated pretty clearly in their discussions. So, IMDb is kind of falling short again every single time.
just like we want it to.
Before we dive into Men completely, though, should we talk about Alex Garland from a higher level? Like, we all have baggage with him, because I always want to get our biases out front, because, I think. From my perspective, obviously, I love 28 Days Later is one of my favorite films. I think it's a great script. He did a wonderful job with that. Sunshine. I think did we see Sunshine together? I feel like we did.
Maybe. Back in 2007. We're pressed for that, though.
Yeah. Interesting ride of a film. Didn't love it at all. The first hour is pretty cool. The rest of it didn't love. He did some rewrites on 20 Weeks Later. We all know that movie's not great. Never Let Me Go. I've actually never seen. Ex Machina and Annihilation are really the starting points of his directorial career here. Neither of which I really like that much. I would say Ex Machina was a great idea that did not play out that well in execution, and I think Annihilation is a film that I just did not really like at all. What about you? What's your baggage dog? So I like his ideas. I just on his directorial side, I'm not the biggest fan.
Yeah, so you have more of a negative bias, and mine's more positive. Though I am very self-aware of the kind of fractures in his ability, both as a storyteller and as a director. Though I do think, and there seems to be a number of critics that seem to agree that as bonkers as Men is, it might be like the most fully like detailed and compelling version of what's been kind of rattling in his brain for a while. And I think part of that is not only because he's gotten some practice along the way, but also because it's a script that he's been tinkering with for a number of years. But we'll get back to that. I think Sunshine is probably his low point. I think he was trying some interesting things there conceptually, like it seems we agree he's always on the mark. Never Let Me Go. I read the book, but I have not gotten around to seeing the movie because I'm concerned about it and how it will both color my thoughts about the novel as well as Alex Garland. He also made the FX series Devs, which I've never explored. But I absolutely adore both Ex Machina and Annihilation.
Oh no!
This knowing
is gonna be a real fun episode.
Full well that they, it's very much like I'm aware of my subjectivity here, but I like messes. Like I really enjoy a filmmaker that has like this utmost clinical control of his craft until the third act. Like that's fun for me. That I'm like, whoa, what is like where what how did you let the wheels go, Alex? And yet now this is like I don't know. After a hat trick of insane third acts, I think that it's become pretty clear now that like it wasn't him making mistakes, it was him making deliberate choices all along.
That's quite fair. Yeah, it's kind of become his style that the film takes on a different dimension as it comes to a conclusion.
Right. So yeah, this will be interesting. So let's talk about Men. How much did you know going into the movie? Because I am one of those people that I very much try to avoid as much as possible before I sit down.
I knew nothing.
Okay, in fact,
I just saw the trailer, and I was like, I will show up for an Alex Garland film just because, like you said, he always swings for the fences. Like, I like that and respect that, even if he fails. Like it's kind of fun. So I was definitely there, but I didn't know anything about it. I didn't read any news about it really. I just heard some rumblings on distribution and stuff like that and box office, but that's really it.
Yeah. It's and similarly, like maybe that was more of my choice going into it, but especially with like a title like this, I think that it almost invites outwardly, and I think A24 has already kind of made this kind of their brand, because I remember doing a similar thing when Midsommar was approaching, and I knew how insane Hereditary was, so I wanted to go into Midsommar as cold as possible, and really having like I think Ex Machina's third act is nuts, but it still kind of it doesn't like go to this like tone, like doesn't do the tonal shift that Annihilation does in its third act. Mm-hmm. And so when I was both like hypnotized by Ex Machina and then like just wide-eyed and speechless after Annihilation, that was a signal to me that like we're dealing with like capital A auteur, kind of like I never saw it, but I think a lot of people tried to do this with Darren Aronofsky's Mother, which Men is getting a lot of comparisons to.
Oh my god, I wish we did an episode on that.
We'll just wait for the anniversary.
It's a very good point because it feels right in line with that type of film.
Yeah.
I mean, someone who's super creative, has a lot of interesting ideas. Someone's given them. We don't have a budget on this one. I'm guessing probably around 15 to 20 million, similar to Ex Machina. He's not going to get the Annihilation budget ever again, which is like 45, 55.
Blew his load.
But yeah, it's kind of free reign. Just go for it. Whatever you want to do. And this is his production partners here at DNA Films, who he's worked with all his entire career has been DNA films.
Mhm.
So it's a comfortable place for him to kind of do whatever he wants, and I think
Yeah.
you definitely see that on screen. That
Yeah,
there's
and
not a lot of hesitation here.
right, and he's become one of those auteurs now. That's like third film. He's got his crew, right?
Mhm.
He had some, Oscar Isaac both in Annihilation, Ex Machina, and there was another actor that was in both as well. And he's making that departure. But in terms of like the craft side of it, I mean, he's got the same composers creating a haunting score. He's got the same cinematographer that like probably knows by now exactly how Alex Garland wants his trees to be shot. And there's this kind of synchronicity to it that is expected by now, and yet he's in the New York Times talking about how he's going to take a break after directing.
That
If not,
interview is really weird.
yeah, he's a
It's like,
fascinating and very strange man. But
yeah,
yeah, he's got this movie he's working with Kirsten Dunst now called Civil War, and similarly, a lot of those same people are back. Like he literally wrapped Men Friday and then started Civil War on Monday.
great.
Uh, but it just feels like the workload, like it's got to take a lot out of you to make these movies,
Yeah,
not only because there's a lot going on conceptually, but also like literally this is his third movie where it has the central theme of isolation, right?
yeah. Uh-huh.
um, and Oscar Isaac's Laboratory and Ex Machina is in the middle of luscious woods. Annihilation is about, this trek to this place where nature has taken over, maybe an extraterrestrial presence as well, in the middle of nowhere. And now here we are, Jesse Buckley's character, Harper, going deliberate, making a choice to go to the middle of nowhere to isolate. And that's got to be like this. Why do these people keep coming back to work for him? What is it about this man? They're
Well, I
like, yeah,
think there's got
we'll
to
go
be
to the.
something. I think he's probably one of those guys who, if you sat down and had like a drink with him at a bar and he wanted to describe his idea to you, after an hour you would be sold.
Right.
And be like, this guy has thought about everything. He's so passionate about it that you
Mm-hmm.
can't make movies like this unless you're all in. And I think that dedication and passion is infectious. And I think he gets, great artists to work with him
Yeah.
because of that. And this one, specifically too, it's like this film, I don't know, it feels to me kind of what you've been hinting at. It feels like he's so comfortable in this element.
Mm-hmm.
Everything about it. And I think when seeing it, it feels like a film. It doesn't have the rawness of, say, an earlier work from a really sort of a strong artist who's confident that wants to say something. It doesn't have that element to it. It has this sort of calm, steady, growing suspense throughout the entire thing. It's really, that part of it's very well done.
Yeah.
I think where the conflict starts, and when you look at the critics and the critical consensus here, is when you're moving from the visuals and the vibe, to use the lovely Zoomer term, um, to the content. And I think that, when looking back at Ex Machina, specifically Ex Machina, which was a movie about philosophy, essentially about artificial intelligence, the vibes were all there. And the vibes were, for the most part, all in Annihilation. The visuals, the sound, everything, it just looked really engaging and awesome. But when you move into the sort of the meat on the bones content and ideas, that's where things get really muddled, I think, with him, and very
Mm-hmm.
nebulous. And I think Men, if we're diving into, sort of the broader performance here of the film in terms of what he's trying to accomplish. Wow, dude! Like, muddled doesn't even begin to start to describe
Yeah.
the last third of this film. I mean, maybe we should sort of think about it in terms of like the cycle theme here.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, this is definitely a thriller. In what sense is it a thriller?
I mean, the biggest observation I made in terms of like traditional genre trappings is like there was a few different points in the movie where I realized like, wait a second, is this just going to be like a strange home invasion thriller, right?
That'd be awesome.
Where
I
I
would
mean,
love
it's
that.
yeah, I know you puritanical bastard. Uh, where like there are so many really affecting traditional shots of Harper getting stalked, getting followed, getting watched, and that was like, I mean, I think that's where so much of the thriller genre comes from, is
Yeah.
that voyeurism, right?
Hmm.
And we'll see that as we traverse the history of the genre throughout the cycle of episodes we have here. But in some cases, there is that really strong. In some scenes, there is that really strong feeling of, okay, I don't want to know what happens next, but I'm going to keep watching
Yeah.
because there's this other half of me, this sadistic half of me that wants to keep watching, which is another kind of more self-aware horror characteristic as well that we came back again and again with, starting with Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, which was all about, trying to challenge the audience and wonder and provoke and poke and ask, do you want to see this or not?
Yeah. No, I think that, and I think with this film and the way that he paces it out in the opening hour, I would say he hits those genre conventions incredibly well. And the building of tension and the building of suspense and that voyeurism, because of his skill set and what he's so strong at, it's very powerful. Her walking alone in the woods.
Yeah.
She's already in this huge house. She's isolated. There's the caretaker is kind of a weird guy, but he doesn't seem very dangerous at all. She takes off into the beautiful British countryside. And there's this moment, this tunnel moment, which is in the trailer. So you see it, and the echoing through the tunnel. And then I thought that was very deft how he did that. Like
Mhm.
he built this sense of calm with her and sort of peace and transparency, and then it's immediately the moment she becomes relaxed, and we become relaxed as the audience, there's this eruption.
Yeah.
And it's a very small thing. It's just a guy gets up in the tunnel and starts running after her,
Very
and it
28
just,
Days Later-ish.
yeah, and it looked like that. It did look like that. And I was very impressed with all of that, because the thriller aspect of this works incredibly well.
Mhm.
And it tends, but it's what's bizarre about it to me is he gets all of that stuff right. um but it's almost like he doesn't believe in his own ability to continue to build tension. There's a lot of reviews that came out about this, and it's sort of like, oh well, it never turns off the suspense. I totally disagree with that, because there's a scene, that scene that I'm talking about, and she sort of gets herself out of that situation through climbing through the forest and kind of making her way back to the house, and then she turns around and takes a picture of this old house, and there's a naked man standing there, the guy who presumably was chasing her. He's just standing there, and it's all of a sudden, when he does this, it's the tension and the mystery of it is gone like that. It's just, there he is. That's the guy who was chasing her. There's no more mystery.
So is that where it lost you?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
She goes back to the house, and then the guy continues to, she's, is it the next day where she's like working and he's outside naked, like watching her? I can't remember the
Or it's
time.
later that afternoon.
I think it's
I
later
feel
that
like that was
afternoon.
like a morning stroll, and then
Yeah.
yeah.
And even by then it's like, okay, I'm still with you, but like if I'm making a thriller, it's like Jaws. Wait to show the shark, right? You don't need to show the shark in the first moment, or in the first half hour. And I think for me, that's when it starts shifting away towards a traditional thriller. I mean, what does it become after that? Is the last third a horror film?
Okay, so we need to talk about the elephant in the room before we get too much deeper into the second
Yeah.
and third acts, which is that uh, Garland makes the very bold choice of having Rory Kinnear, character actor, play every single male character in the film except for her soon-to-be ex-husband in flashbacks.
Yeah.
Right? So at first, the caretaker, like you mentioned, he's kind of strange but seems harmless. And then we see the naked man that's stalking her. He's cut up or wounded somehow, but he looks like a bald version of the caretaker. And so we're wondering, like, what happened? At least what I'm wondering is, did the caretaker, like, something happen to him and all his hair fell out? I'm like, what the hell's going on, Alex? But then I really didn't fully realize that he had gone with this like theatrical conceit until, because I saw like glimpses of the police officers that came to arrest the naked man in the front yard, and I was like, wait a second, that actor looks kind of like Rory Kinnear too. And then it's when she sits down with a female police officer to give her account, and you fully realize that, like, yes, it's the same actor playing at least now 3 fully different characters: the male police officer that she doesn't interact with at first, and the caretaker, and the stalker. And then she goes to a pub later that night, and there's more Rory Kinnears, the bartender, the barflies, and she goes to a church, the vicar. There's even a little boy with.
That's the one that because you could see the de-aging technology.
Right.
It was pretty apparent.
Which maybe is a choice, or maybe was like him realizing he couldn't get it to look much better than the Irishman, so he just said, "Let's make it a choice." I don't know, but I mean, there's definitely those moments where you are forced to kind of reckon with this existential question, which I think comes back to your comment about, when do you show the monster? But if part of the central conceit is that Harper, our protagonist, sees all the men in this town as the same, then it feels like that's a thematically appropriate choice, in my opinion, to make it seem like there's this threat to her, and the threat is like homogenous and all consuming and all surrounding, and it's all the same face.
Good point. I'll take that, but I would parry back with this: is that, does she ever acknowledge that they're all the same people?
No, she doesn't, and that's clearly that's part of that, taking you out of it, kind of like the de-aged face, where it's like, okay, so we're supposed to accept that she doesn't see those people, but that's clearly a choice on behalf of the director.
Is that what really happens, though? I guess that's another part that I was confused on. Does she not realize that they're all the same people?
I mean, I mentioned how it's theatrical because that's like literally a theater technique, right? To keep casts small on stage performances, so that like it's very common that, if one actor is playing the protagonist, but then there's like one actor that's playing various supporting roles, and the character, the protagonist doesn't acknowledge that, because then that would break from the artifice of a cast of characters. And to his credit, like, I didn't think of Rory Kinnear as much more than just the guy from that one Black Mirror episode, but he does incredibly well, I think, with the task at hand, even if it takes us out of the movie. It feels like, you got this push and pull. Garland saying, take yourself out and start asking questions, and Rory Kinnear's job is to try to sell it as much as he can to both Jessie Buckley's character and to the audience. And I liked that tension, even though I was very skeptical of it at first when it was apparent. But then I think the other elephant in the room that we need to dig into is that third act, which is
a lot of elephants in the room.
where there's so much being thrown at the wall that it's not just about, the titular men in this town / in Jessie Buckley's world, but about so much more: birth and nature and stuff.
Birth, nature stuff, man. I don't know. Before we talk about the third act, I think I do want to talk a little bit about, and I think this fits into the existential part of this, is her husband's suicide and the flashbacks. Because if this was just all taking place in the village in that present day, and we didn't see those pretty intense flashback sequences, the formalism of the film might, to me, have worked a lot more. But when there's, I don't know how many flashbacks there are, there's probably like 3 or 4. where she's reliving a fight with her husband at the time, and he is, going through. He's abusive. He's going through obviously some sort of mental illness issue, and she's deciding to get divorced, and they fight, and he threatens to kill himself, which is a form of emotional abuse. And then he hits her. It literally hits her in the face, punches her right in the face, and that sort of creates this extreme reaction on her side, obviously, where she's like, "Get out!" And then that's presumably when he, there's a moment where it's like, "Oh, did he actually kill himself, or did he slip trying to get back into the apartment?" I mean, I don't know. That's sort of confusion. Also, why are we doing that? Like, you don't need to do that. All those flashbacks and stuff, to me, imply it adds that layer of existential confusion, because she's trying to ultimately understand, one, why did he abuse her in that way? Why did he erupt in that way? Two, why did he take his own life?
Yeah.
Why did he go through that action? And then there's all of this potential guilt involved on her side of, what if I did X? What if I did Y? And I think there's a certain sort of, she has lost herself in a very deep way, which adds to, going to a strange place you don't know. She's already lost inside. And then the sort of oddness of the village and the inhabitants sort of adds another layer of confusion about what happened to her husband, and how she was responded, how she was responsible, how she's supposed to move on.
Yep.
And it's all intertwining. I thought that actually was really fascinating. But I have no idea what any of this has to do with the third act. I couldn't even, if you paid me $1 million, I'd be like, I got nothing. I couldn't draw you a line. If I drew you a line, it would be like scribbles.
Yeah.
And so how, I mean, the third act, like, okay, so when do you find the third act is starting? When she gets back to the house?
Yes, when she has essentially decided to call her friend Riley, who she FaceTimes with throughout the film, and take her friend up on her offer of coming to stay the night with her. I think that turn right there is when things go bananas. And I mean, Alex Garland has said this in numerous interviews, not just for this press circuit, but for his other films as well. And he said it again here with IndieWire, quote, "I think usually interpretations on films are more telling about the person doing the interpretation rather than the film itself," which is like one of those, Brechtian cop-outs in some respects, right? Where it's like, I don't know what I was trying to do. You figure it out. But at the same time, like, I personally enjoy wrestling with those kinds of messes. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that Annihilation, for all its craft, like, if it hadn't had that bonkers third act turn centering on Natalie Portman's character, I probably would have been like, oh yeah, that's a slightly memorable sci-fi film. And I think that that's what makes Men, for all its very apparent questionings, debatably, a kind of interesting combination of what he was trying to do in Ex Machina, with the sense of atmosphere and the question of birth and nature, which I think are legitimate things in Ex Machina, both thematically and conceptually. And he brings those back here. And I wonder, like, if he was tinkering with this screenplay for 15 years, was it essentially this third act that he really couldn't crack until he figured out what he was going to do, both with Ex Machina and then with Annihilation? So, like, the atmosphere and craft of Ex Machina combined with the bananas third act turn of Annihilation, and he gets to say that it's not based on anything. It's, from his fucked up mind. And you've got Men. And does it congeal? No, not at all. I think it's very fair criticism to call it a muddled film, both thematically and conceptually. But is it compelling? I think absolutely. I was sold.
What do you find compelling? Like, what was compelling about it to you? And I don't mean that in like a accusatory way.
You know,
I'm just like very
how could you
curious as
possibly?
how like just like really what did you find so compelling about it?
I found a compelling. Well, to go back to your question, your kind of wonderings about the connection between what's going on with Harper in the present day in this Airbnb
Yeah.
versus her past traumas, and this is something that's going to come up a lot this cycle, right?
Mhm.
We are going to talk at length about Michael Douglas's character in the game, who also is had this traumatic experience, though it's years later, of a loved one committing suicide, right?
Mhm.
Um, and Mads Mikkelsen's character in The Hunt, we'll talk about how he deals with a traumatic situation, and it gets spun into a thriller yarn. Stephen Ray's IRA character in The Crying Game, like that is going to be this continual question. And by I don't think that throwing spaghetti at the wall is ever like just for its own purposes a good idea for a filmmaker to do. But when
Mhm.
you have somebody that is able to do it in such a like visually uh innovative and like disturbingly um nightmarish way, like Alex Garland, then I'm gonna be in. I'm going to follow it all the way to the end and laugh at it and chew on it and be shocked by it, because that's kind of one of the things that I'm always looking for in movies. And I think one of the most fascinating things, just by like reading up on people's reactions to it, that it really makes us think about when it comes to the main theme of gender, and
Mhm.
because that is very much built into both the backstory, like you said, with her interactions with him and emotional abuse as a husband, but then also with these interactions with Rory Kinnear's various characters, both like the nice guy caretaker that could turn on you if you're not careful, and the priest that's constantly judging you. Um, and how like little boys are socialized
Mhm.
to expect whatever they want from a potentially maternal figure. And so like to end with birth and nature, I think the nature part is like Garland's careerist kind of common thread. Like even in Sunshine, right? There's
Mhm.
like that focus on the garden and the spaceship. Um, and the birth part is more going back to like the origins of um, metaphorically her grief and the gender parity and the uh, starting over aspect of her coming to this house in the middle of nowhere. And so there's enough there where it's exciting and it's thrilling, and a lot of the response has been like, oh, that disgusting third act. But like I found myself like because he does this thing, spoiler alert if you haven't been spoiled enough already, where it's not just like a birth scene with like a vaginal opening and everything, but like it's done ad nauseum, like birth upon birth upon birth, and there's all these close-ups of this vaginal imagery. Um, but like I found myself immediately being like, wait a second, like I find this like horrific or disgusting, but like I shouldn't be finding birth horrific or disgusting,
Mhm.
even in this like very like home invasion-ish thing. So I think it does a good job of asking enough questions while not trying to answer any of them. But I don't think that Alex Garland's the kind of filmmaker that wants to answer questions.
No, of course not. Like he just wants to put it out there and see what happens. And in this
Yeah.
case, a lot's happening in terms of the reaction. Like it is I think you obviously have a certain read on it. Like the specific scene that you're talking about, the birthing scene, the thing that didn't trouble me so much about it didn't seem all that disgusting. Like it was kind of like any sort of gory film. No worse than anything in Dead Alive, right? Um
But that's the thing. Like, it's not gore, right? There's
I would disagree
the
with that. I would disagree
the
with that. I would say
the hand
that
is gore,
what was
and
that?
like the hand, like the cut up hand and the broken foot, but like the actual like birthing of Rory Kinnear over and over again.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I would absolutely say that it's a gore. It's gore. It's going for gore, without a doubt. I think that's the reasons where I was sort of like, I think that's this scene where I was like, oh, like I absolutely hate this movie, like vehemently, because like it's a moment that is so self masturbatory,
Mhm.
right? It is just like so over the top and so without any sort of self awareness, like zero. And then he proceeds to just shove it in our face over and over again. And it's like, dude, I get what you're going for. That's kind of a cool idea. But how many times does it happen? 4 or 5 times?
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to walk out. Like I was just like, this is just dumb. Like, and like the grotesque part of it is like whatever. Like either it's gore or whatever. It's, you know, and you can talk about sort of the female aspect of it. Oh my god, the amount of baggage with that of a man trying to make a movie
Mhm, mhm.
that speaks some sort of deep truth about womanhood. Uh, Incredibly problematic. Nothing necessarily inherently wrong with that. But trying to go for it in that way, God, why did Jesse Buckley sign on to this, man? Did you read the script? I mean, my God.
But that's
But
for
I think
okay.
I represent kind of a broader response to it,
Yeah. And I
right?
mean,
Like,
I like I laughed at that ending, but and he doesn't come across as like a guy with a sense of humor necessarily, but you have to have some kind of like levity to it. I think Rory Kinnear has a lot of levity as an actor, and I don't think it's a mistake that he picked him. But I also think that like it's interesting you bring up the question of like Jesse Buckley, who's very talented and is like an incredible rising star in Hollywood and beyond. Would sign on to it because you could say the same. You could say similar things of like Alicia Vikander in Ex Machina and uh, Natalie Portman and all the other female characters in Annihilation. Like this has become Garland's thing. Is there's the Ringer podcast um, is an interesting dissection of that, both from male critic point of view and female critic point of view, where it's like it almost feels it 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 feels like this is one guy's eternal quest as an author to answer the question, what is woman? And and he does it. I don't know. I was worried about that. I honestly was very concerned about that aspect of it. A
yeah,
guy director trying to make a movie about how horrific men are as a gender, um, and yet I just came out of it with such like just like shaking my head, but in a way that like got me thinking, that got me excited to see what the heck this Civil War movie is going to be. Um, and I think that that's ultimately, I don't know. I think as much as I hate that kind of Brechtian cop out answer of, well, what's your interpretation? I, for whatever reason, I think it works. It reminded me actually a lot of another movie I like a lot by a director that's otherwise very respected, Denis Villeneuve.
yeah,
And I like all his movies to some degree, but I think my favorite is the movie he did with Jake Gyllenhaal called Enemy,
yeah.
and it also has like this batshit third act, and yet it's something that sticks with you. Like I don't. It comes back to a question, an argument that we've had a number of times on this podcast: is it better to be memorable or to be cohesive? And I feel like maybe you you err on the side of
I'm definitely on
cohesion.
the cohesive side, without a
Yeah, and
doubt.
I'm
Yeah.
more on the side of memorable. We were talking about that with House, right? The
Yes.
1977 Japanese film.
Yeah. I mean, they both have their yeah, they both have their effects and
Mhm.
consequences. You know, because you talk about like a movie like House is, you know, a lot of people are into it, you know, whatever, 40 years later, I guess it was.
Yeah.
Um, and it's had this huge impact on artists, right? And but like, has it had an impact on a broader category of people? Not really at all. I think this movie is going to be one of those similar ones as well. You look at the general audience reaction, D plus cinema score, horrific. Rotten Tomato score, audience variance score of 43%, awful. 39% all score. I mean, these are just terrible scores across. I love the Google score is 21%. That's
Amazing.
like I've never seen anything like that in my life. don't think I've ever seen anything below like 70.
Right.
But the critics kind of like it, right?
Yeah.
73% on Tomatoes, 62% top critics are a little bit less buoyant about it. But yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. It's like what, in terms of cultural importance, if we talk about that, there's no doubt in my mind this movie is going to have an effect on creatives and artists and filmmakers in the future. But I think that that effect is going to be really niche.
Yeah.
It's going to be isolated. It's not really going to go out to any sort of group beyond that. And I'm really excited to talk about the Chaser film here.
Yes.
Because The Killing of a Sacred Deer came out in 2017. The really good companion piece to this one. What if you filtered it through that sort of dichotomy, memorable versus cohesive?
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating kind of coincidence that we wound up picking both of these films, not really realizing, in my opinion, anyways, how similar thematically they would end up being. I had seen Killing of a Sacred Deer like in 2018, about a year after its release. This is its 5-year anniversary, and I watched it kind of with one eye open, going in and out of sleep. So I gave it a full, like, careful watch this time, and I was like, this movie's even stranger than I remember. And I knew that it was going to be strange because I had seen Yorgos Lanthimos, the Greek director's other films, Dogtooth and The Favorite, which he's probably most known for by now, but also The Lobster, which also featured Colin Farrell in the lead role. And so I think even more so than Alex Garland, like, that Lanthimos has a very apparent and distinct sense of humor, right?
Yes.
And so that's maybe what makes his movies a little more palatable, even though they're just as, if not more, strange in terms of like storytelling and characterization and acting. But I'm so with Killing of a Sacred Deer. I think it's an amazing film. But in this case, I really dislike the ending.
Yeah. Okay.
Where did you go? Oh, well, I maybe it's the opposite reason, because it's just a very kind of blunt and succinct ending, exactly
It's
where
mechanical. People think the movie's very mechanical.
Yeah. Did you feel that way in like a positive or negative way?
Oh, in an incredibly positive way.
Oh my God.
Yeah, dude, it's so tight. It's like tight as a snare drum, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's so but the reason that I like that is because what the ending does in Killing of a Sacred Deer is it reifies the entire previous 90 minutes or whatever. And so what it does to the story and the experience of watching the film is that you go back, and if you rewatch it after you've seen the ending, every scene takes on a more heightened, to me at least, a more heightened sense of importance. Every single scene, because it's all leading towards this one end.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of there's a stabilization, essentially, in that story, a stabilization of justice. Justice has been fulfilled in a very mythological, bizarre, crazy way. But because it's mechanical and because essentially the circle is closed at the end, it just feels like a much fuller cinematic experience to me, a narrative experience, I should say. So that I don't know, to me, it's going to stay with me way longer than Men will.
Really?
Because if I try to go back and watch Men, I'd be like, well, none of this matters because it's all nonsensical. Like it's absurdist, and like absurdism is fine. It works in some things, like the movie Hot Rod works really well in that movie. But it works well in comedy, I should say overall. But with Men, because I don't think the circle's ever closed in the narrative at all, and it's open ended, it makes it, I don't know, to me, it lessens the entire impact, one, of the film itself and the scenes and experience them, but two, the author's intention and what he's trying to say. I think when you look at Killing of a Sacred Deer, it may not have a thesis behind it, but it has a lot of emotional and poetic points to make. And I can't necessarily say that about Men. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't. And you look at a lot of some of the reviews and stuff, and they were pretty harsh, some of them. But I think the ones that stick out to me, um, and this is a good dichotomy, is that Killing of a Sacred Deer felt very complete, well thought out, well planned, and well executed, whereas Men felt, I think, um, eh, creative but not planned in any sort of way that would make any logical sense to a viewer, and not really completed. I think one of the viewers or one of the reviews, I can't remember which one it says, this feels incomplete to me. And I think that's the thing that sticks out to me, is like, that's not Men to me in the third act just screams to me you didn't know how to finish the story. And films can get away with that because they're a visual and audio medium, but ultimately they can't get away with it because it's still a story at the end of the day. And if you can't complete the story, and I would make the same criticism of Annihilation, especially, and Ex Machina to some degree, I think that's just boring at the end. It's like he doesn't, for a novelist too. He's a novelist. The guy started as a novelist. And The Beach was his big book. He was the voice of Generation X, Alex Garland.
Mm-hmm.
I would just expect a more literary completist final product, and it's not there. I mean, I don't know. Am I being unfair to him?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a certain literary quality that could easily be argued on the other side of the coin, where it's like, I mean, I'm constantly trying to encourage students, both of film and literature, that like you don't have to have everything wrapped up. I would actually, almost ironically, argue that Killing of a Sacred Deer feels more incomplete, because it feels to me like it's just okay. By the way, if you don't know the film, the setup is that Colin Farrell plays Stephen, a surgeon who befriends a teenage boy who we find out later, is the son of a man that he accidentally lost, who died on the operating table. And so the teenage boy has tried to like reel Colin Farrell's character in, and then presents him with this kind of ice cold revenge, angel of death style, fantastical, unrealistic premise, where it's like, I've made it so that your entire family, wife and 2 kids, will start dying, and you have to choose which one of them to kill. Otherwise, all 3 of them will die. Mm-hmm. And that will be, my justice for you not being in charge, or whatever. It's questionable whether he was drinking the day of the operation of the kid's father or whatever. Anyway, so like it feels like a limp choice to just be like, okay, and spoiler alerts for Killing of a Sacred Deer, to just he ends up killing somebody, and one of the 3 people in his family. It's random, which fits in very much with the existential theme, right? Of like, nothing matters. The world is chaos. The more I guess despairing nihilist version of existentialism, because there's also a very Christian version of existentialism that's all about using your life as you have it. But it feels like, yeah, you're right, it is mechanical, and I get it's purposely so, and it maybe adds to the darkness of the overall themes of the film. And I'm not saying I wanted Colin Farrell's character to figure out a way to keep all 3 of his family members alive, because he's clearly flawed. And there's very much like a question there about his role as a patriarch, and that gender roles in many ways play a part in this film. But I just wanted there to be something thought-provoking at the ending. And I had so much to think about after Men. Mm-hmm. And after Killing of a Sacred Deer, I was like, it was pretty funny when Colin Farrell showed his armpit hair. But other than that, like, I don't know. Yeah. I admire Yorgos Lanthimos as a director much more than I enjoy actually watching and thinking about his movies. And there's a quote with him in the Atlantic that I think kind of pinpoints exactly my ultimate issue that I take with him. They ask him, because he filmed a real open heart surgery for the opening shot. And the interviewer, David Sims, I think, of the Atlantic, asks him, like, why did you choose to start with a shot of a heart? And he says, well, it's a film about a heart surgeon, so I thought it made sense to open with a heart. And it's just like, it's funny and it's amusing. Hot Rod is funny and amusing, but it doesn't, I don't think it's going to sit with me the way that Men did.
Interesting. It's very fascinating. I mean, it's like, I think the big thing too that sticks out to me is that in Killing of a Sacred Deer, there is this, the characters are so active, right? They have to be, and by the end, there's this ultimate act. And yeah, sure, it's random, but the decision to put a mask over your head or whatever and like spin around in a circle and shoot at your family with a rifle is an action, right? And he just decides to act, even in the face of incredible doubt. And is this guy really true? Like, this is like a myth, like what's going on? But there's the protagonist, and that is making action. I mean, what does Jessie Buckley do in Men? Like, how is she acting besides running away from men? And like, okay, she stabs one. It just, man, it just felt, I think to me, it's almost like, in terms of like, you're thinking about it in music, there's just not enough melody to it, and there's not enough harmony in the notes to make it all sing. And I think there's a lot of discord and stuff, and it's like,
a film about discord, though, right?
Yeah, but I mean, in the sense that, like, I'm not talking about emotional discord. I'm talking like the narrative harmony.
See, and I find it harmonious to have the narrative match the theme.
Gotcha. So like, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. But I guess I think to me it's that, like, you whatever emotional or poetic intention that Alex Garland has, it's like the whole, what's the John Cage piece where it's just silence?
Right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. 8:33.
It's kind of similar to that. It's like, oh yeah, that's cool. In theory, that's cool as an artistic statement. As a piece of music, it's meaningless. Right? There's nothing actually there to engage with. It's posturing. And that posturing is important, right? But it's, you're not actually producing anything. Right?
Mm-hmm.
No one listens to that track or song and comes away with it with anything.
And I think that,
like, I mean, like, that's, and then this is Alex Garland's Men is not necessarily like that, but it's in that realm of sort of, let me kind of do whatever I want and not think about the repercussions and not think about how people are going to react to it. And like, this is the end result.
Right. And you're gonna either take it as a curio as part of a larger oeuvre, which I think people do with John Cage's piece, where like, yeah, people do return to John Cage. There's a reason people keep still are talking about him. People do return to him, and I think for better or worse, and I think for better, people are going to keep coming back to Alex Garland, and this is just like this one drop in the bucket. But we're gonna be talking about Men for a while. I'm pretty sure
we're gonna get a lot more movies like Men over the next 20 years.
And that's the other thing. Is like there could have so easily been like a really like trite bad version of this, right? Where it's like a movie that's trying to be, and this is one of the biggest things that he kept having to deflect on in interviews, is like this script has been existing far before the Me Too movement, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's got to be so many bad scripts that I mean, at least if they've been produced, I haven't seen them, about like just like tying everything together in a perfect bow about the relationships between men and women, and how men view women, how men treat women. And I appreciate that he decided to eschew that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but did he though?
I mean, he did title it Men.
I mean, yeah, he's pretty much on, like, he's going for something, right? And it's
right.
At the end of the day, it reminds me of the Last House on the Left thing. It's like artist's intention versus the consequences of the actual film.
Sure.
And it's like, I think Alex Garland, his intention was to do something special, unique, and interesting. And I think the consequences or the results of it are divisive at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
And I think unclear
I'll say this to close us out. I think that no matter what your feelings on the film, this film will do for English cottages in the countryside what Jaws did for sharks.
Amazing. Fantastic. What do we have coming up next in the existential thriller film cycle?
It's a good one.
Michael Clayton, right?
Right. It is the 15th anniversary of the George Clooney legal thriller that is kind of one of the deeper iterations of that specific subgenre of thriller, as well as the chaser film The Hunt, which I mentioned earlier with Mads Mikkelsen as a teacher that gets pretty embroiled in controversy. And that's by the just recently Oscar-winning director Thomas Vinterberg of Another Round. So I'm excited for that. And after that, we'll get into, as I mentioned earlier, The Game from David Fincher, starring Michael Douglas. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.